tonight, Sigmund Freud. I don't know how Freud plays to the general public. I'm an academic, and I know he's pretty much disdained by my colleagues. I understand why, and we're going to talk about why some tonight, but I also think you dismiss him at your peril. Because pretty much every therapeutic practice today is influenced by Freud. If only it's the talking cure. That was Freud, and as you'll see, one of his early partners. I tell the story, and I don't know if you saw the mailing, but I tell this story because I think it's a perfect little parable about Freud. I had this student who wanted to write a paper on Freud, and she despised Freud for all the good reasons, his sexism, his unscientific approach, etc. But throughout the paper, she spelled his name F-R-A-U-D. So she had a little slip of the pen there, right? And I always say Freud, you can't live with him, can't live without him. You prove him right, even in trying to disprove him sometimes. His name was actually Sigmund Freud, which may be the reason for some of his anxiety. 1856 to 1939, born in Vienna, was allowed to leave for England in 1938 for reasons that you might guess. He was one of the lucky ones. He was a scientist and a physician. So he began his work with studies in hysteria. Freud is still known for this first treatment of, this is the late 19th century, early 20th century. These were women who were just crazy, as they would say. They were overreacting emotionally to things, as science determined women did from that point all the way back through history. What they found was, Joseph Breuer and Freud, their partnership, was that if women were allowed to speak freely about their experiences with this condition, that they got better. Who would have thought? Well, Breuer and Freud thought. And that led them to believe that there was some deep traumatic experience that they were trying to work through that was forgotten or hidden, that they couldn't recover on their own or consciously, and so they needed a treatment. And this would become psychoanalysis, to bring that original trauma to light in a particular way, and frankly in a particular setting. Okay, and that is the psychoanalyst office. And we'll talk about what that means, but isn't that a great sculpture, the Arch of Hysteria, Louise Bourgeois. Yeah. So he begins with, Freud breaks off on his own, and remember, he was a scientist, and he had an MD, effectively, he was a doctor, and so he saw himself always as a scientist, and doing scientific work, and doing the work of a physician. But his first publication in 1900 was Interpretation of Dreams. Still probably his most famous work, his most influential work. In 1901, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. In 1905, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. 1909, he begins to lecture in the US. Now look at that. That's rather amazing. These are significant works. I mean, no one knew they were going to be significant, even Freud probably, but within 5 years, you've got 3 major works that launch a unique and profound theory that we're still living with over 100 years later. And it all happened very quickly. He was not accepted, as geniuses usually are. He's not accepted by his peers in the European community. But he gets an invitation to go to Clark University in Worcester, Mass. In 1909. And he goes to America, and like many people who came to America, he finds his fame, and it continues to grow. So, we talked about this a little bit with Kierkegaard. I don't want to psychoanalyze Freud too much, but then he's asking for it. His father had two sons by a previous marriage, Emmanuel and Philip. And the young Freud often played with Philip's son, John. You got this? There's this deep anachronism in the family already. So he's playing with his father's grandson, and they're about the same age. Freud's own self-analysis, which he did in the interpretation of dreams, originated, he says his emotional crisis originated with the death of his father, of course, not uncommon, and the series of dreams that came after that. He realizes that his feelings of guilt and fear and love and loss for his father were all tied up in this John, half-brother, if that's what he is. Half-brother once. Anyway, I guess he's half-brother. He can't separate his feelings and all his actually very powerful feelings from this John. And they've kind of merged. And so for his own psychoanalysis, he works to separate those. And in fact, he says that one of his fantasies was that his half-brother, Philip, about the age of his mother, was really his father. And he draws great meaning from this fantasy, of course, because he's Freud, and you can see how that affects his theory. And that he thinks in his fantasy at least, he thinks that he wishes that his real father were dead, so that the other guy would be his father, because he was a rival for his mother's affections. Here we go, right? This, of course, you may recognize already as the Oedipus complex that we're going to come back to. But remember, Freud was actually a scientist. He was, in fact, a physicist. So he was very much influenced by the discoverer of the laws of thermodynamics, Helmholtz. And I don't know if you remember these from college, but the first law of thermodynamics is that matter or energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. Second law is that when that change of form happens, energy is lost. Well, as you're going to see, this is the way the psyche works for Freud. Keep that in mind. In fact, the whole theory of the psyche that Freud proposes is based on energy. It's that we have these various energies within us, and they're transforming and moving and interacting. It's very much a physicist's model for the psyche. Of course, one of his great contributions to intellectual history is this notion of the unconscious. This is a very powerful notion, obviously. It is, he would hate this, but it is actually akin to the religious stage of human beings as theorized by certain anthropologists, where you don't understand what's happening in the world. You hear a noise like thunder, you don't understand its origin, and so you are afraid. For Freud, this happened within silence. And in fact, I want you to think about the significance of this, that your behavior, things you do in everyday life, is psychopathological. Because your behaviors are being driven by something you can't see, can't know. If that's true, wow, we're in deep trouble, right? If there's an unconscious that I can't access, but it's shaping, creating my behaviors and my interactions with the world and with each other, I'm in need of great help. Fortunately, there is help. Father Freud created some help for us. And of course, this unconscious is not, it doesn't have a complete lid on it, right? It peeks through every now and then, such as with my student who was so angry at Freud that she kept spelling his name Fraud. Slips of the pen, dreams especially. The unconscious seeps through, and it's not always pleasant. In fact, I'd say it's very rarely pleasant. It's usually discomforting when the unconscious peeks through with these unexpected emergences. And they're unexpected because, as we'll see, there's another force, another energy that's keeping all that down, keeping it tamped down, but it never fully succeeds, which makes this so interesting. Freud's idea was that freedom's just another word for neurosis. Because if you think you're free, and if he's right about the unconscious, then you are suffering under a great delusion. And in fact, you have a neurosis called freedom, because you're not free. To act as if you're free, as if you're an agent in the world, unaffected by anything other than your own will, is a recipe for neurosis and pathology, according to Freud. But as I said, he offers us a way out, and it is psychoanalysis, which is to take the unconscious and bring it to light, bring it to consciousness, but you must be very, very careful with this, because there's monster in you, living there in the unconscious, called the id. I'm going to get to that in a minute. If you've ever studied Freud, you'll probably remember the iceberg diagram. And so his theory of the psyche is that what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. There's all this underneath. Let's talk about what's underneath. So, energies of the mind, right? Physics. This is thermodynamics. Okay. So what are these drives? What are these two main energies? The one is eros, which is, we know that God from our studies in Greek mythology, eros and psyche. Psyche means soul, by the way, the basis of psychology. We tend to think of eros as sexual, and it is sexual, but it's not just sexual. Freud also called it the libido. So we should think of eros, or the libido, as the life force. So not just sex, but what sex ultimately represents, again, from a scientific perspective, which is the drive to reproduce, which is ultimately a drive to survive, to pass on life. So yes, it's associated with sexuality, but ultimately it's associated with preservation of your own. Again, we're talking about the unconscious, so this is not logical, but the idea is to preserve your self, your suke, your soul, by recreating yourself in another person, your child. And then, of course, there's thanatos drive, from the Greek word for death. This is aggression, self-destruction. So it's not just the death drive for you, it's you trying to act out the death drive in the world. It's destruction. And these are the two drives. These are the two energies that compete in our psyche, says Freud. So here's a good point to offer a corrective to Freud that you've probably heard a lot. Not all human behaviors are sexual in nature, or they don't spring from eros or the libido. We have a destructive drive. And I think that's pretty evident. Right? I don't think we need to make that case that we can be self-destructive and we can be just generally destructive. And Freud would say he gets really detailed about this, and it's a little hard to follow, but I think he's right. He says ultimately, he says, the death drive is about giving up. It's about being tired of the tension of life. Tension is an important word for Freud. And ultimately, it's a desire to get back to the only peaceful place you have in your psychic memory, which is the womb. We can't get back to the womb. So the closest thing is the tomb. Right? So think about it. When you put a body in the ground, it is a kind of womb. It's the womb of Mother Earth you're putting the body into. With perhaps hope of a regard. It doesn't matter because the psyche doesn't think that way. The psyche thinks just in terms of symbols. And so that looks like a good symbol. That looks like a symbol of a womb. And so that's going to work. It's the same problem when the infant will suck on her thumb. It doesn't matter. Right? It's not about, it's just about the symbol. It's about the representation, not the real thing. It's not going to get milk or nourishment from it. So not everything's about sex. Some of it's about death. How cool is that? And we should understand Freud's understanding of sexuality in terms of pleasure in general. Like I said, he was very interested in tension. In fact, if you wanted to summarize Freud at a bar, you're having a single malt, somebody comes up and says, really, what was Freud about? I can give you an answer for that. The answer is about it. Freud, just say Freud is about tension and release. Tension and release. And there's all kinds of tensions, and there's all kinds of releases. Obviously, we think of sexual tension and release, but hunger is the same thing. Defecation is the same thing. Tension and release. And of course, here's where Freud is genius, is he takes those physical aspects of life and he metamorphosizes them into psychic realities about tension and release. All right. So this course is called Stages Along Life's Way. Here are the stages. The oral stage, 0 to 18 months. So, you've seen this. The child tries to gratify her libidinal energy through her mouth by sucking, biting, chewing, etc. You've seen this, right? Yeah. According to Freud, if a person is dissatisfied at this stage, as we'll see, psychic well-being or illness for Freud is how well you manage conflicts, starting as an infant. So, yeah. Really, that's about your parents, right? So if an infant is dissatisfied at this stage, then she's characterized by pessimism, suspicion, sarcasm, Charlie, just saying, and grows into an adult who reduces tension through chewing gum or the ends of a pen or pencil. Such a person is said to have an oral receptive personality. On the other hand, an overindulged person, remember this is really about your parents and they're to blame. An overindulged person in the oral stage is aggressive, optimistic, gullible, hostile, all these things because you've overstimulated the child, and so there's just like this violence, right? A normal person, we're in dangerous territory there, is characterized by indulging in smoking, kissing, eating, oral pleasures, etc. So, as with everything with Freud, there's a kind of Aristotelian golden mean here. But you'll see what I'm talking about. The anal stage, 18 months to 3.5 years. A fixation may occur during this stage by the child's parents if they're too strict about this toilet training stage. The child may react to that strictness by becoming an anal retentive personality. I'm sure you don't know any of those. Stinginess, excessive tidiness, perfectionism, and stubbornness. The other is the anal expulsive personality, lack of self-control, carelessness, and messy behavior. This is where a lot of people lose Freud. The phallic stage, 3.5 years to 6 years. How parents react to the behavior of their children during this stage, when the child is playing with his or her genitals, when they show or reading from the Genesis myth, we would say they were naked and not ashamed, right? And I think that is the Genesis, but we can get to that another time. This is where the Oedipus complex occurs. The genital stage, the phallic stage, sorry, where sexuality is not, well, according to Freud, it's sexuality, where the child recognizes sexual differences between his parents and the role and sexual roles, we would say gender roles. 3.5 to 6 years, the child notices this. Okay. Now, we can get into this later. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what about little girls and the Oedipus complex? Remember, the Oedipus complex for Freud is centered on men, like everything in Freud, and every major thinker Freud, where the child sees the father. I'm going to get to this in a minute, but I wanted you to understand the state. Sees the father as competition for the love of the mother, sexual love, and so wants to kill the father and be joined with the mother. What about little girls? Freud said they didn't really have that. There was a lack in little girls. Jung would come along and say, you know what, no, there is something like this. Carl Jung, Freud's most famous student, whom we're talking about next week, said that there's an electric complex where the little girl has feelings for her father, and is jealous of her mother. And in fact, this is what caused Freud and Jung to fall out. Jung was his favorite, most beloved student, and they couldn't reconcile over the Oedipus complex because Freud wouldn't allow for a feminine version of it. And of course, Jung thought that Freud, that there was something other than sexuality driving our development. There's the latency stage, 6 years to puberty, where Freud said children express no sexual feelings. They suppress, or he would say, well, depending on the activity, sublimate their energy into school, athletics, hobbies, social relationships, friendships, etc. If you fixate here, if you stop here, if you don't resolve these issues at the latency stage, you will be sexually unfulfilled later in life. The genital stage is puberty to adulthood, really until death. Children reach sexual maturity, and then they start to experiment with sexuality. If children with more resolved psychosexual development at this stage can develop normal relationships with the opposite sex for Freud, whereas fixation at this stage results, if you can't get through this stage and the issues of this stage, you will become frigid and impotent and unsatisfactory social relationships. I can't be sure of this, but I believe this is where Freud says homosexuality emerges. I may be wrong about that, but I believe that's what he said. So, stages along life's way for Freud is all about conflict and resolution. It's about tension and release. And there are particular tensions and particular ways to release those tensions in each stage. Okay, on its surface, that's kind of right, isn't it? I mean, it's possibly too generic to put it that way, and Freud actually got into very great detail and into very great trouble by going into such detail. But that's it. That's how we develop. Everything is centered in the body, and in particular, sexuality, or at least erogenous zones like the oral, like mouth, the anus, etc. Okay. More about the Oedipus complex. Here is where Freud is genius, I think. He's a scientist. He even is a physicist. Considers himself such. He is a medical doctor. And yet, he tells the story of a Greek play to make it our story. See, he doesn't go into data points physiology or anatomy, he tells a myth. And that's how he wins, is he tells a story that, maybe we think that's a weird story, that's not my story, but at least it's a story and you have to deal with it. The desire for the mother. Well, we see this in mythology. We see this attempt to reconnect with the feminine. And we talk about that a lot in here, about our loss of connection to the feminine. It's in The Hero's Journey by Campbell, where the hero cannot become a hero without rediscovering his feminine element, aspect. He must marry the goddess. You know what else he must do? Kill the father, right? And that's the Oedipus complex, because the father produces fear. And you must, to become a hero, in Campbell's sense, you must overcome that fear. And the symbolic way to do that is to kill your father. Now, that works out to, metaphorically, to mean you reject your father's authority over you, right? So when we talk about killing the father, that's what happens in the play, right? I don't know if you remember the play, but Oedipus is told that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, and he's like, okay, well, I'll fix that. And so he goes way out of his way to do it, so he tries to avoid fate. And he can't, in fact, ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. But we do have, you don't have to be Freudian to know that your mother has a certain kind of influence and your father has a certain kind of influence. And we can extrapolate across the species to some degree about that. I think that's fair to say, right? And so therefore, becoming an adult, becoming who we are, to invoke our title of the series, involves dealing with that in some way. Of not replicating your father or your mother, but becoming, as Jung will say next week, individuated from them, to becoming your own person, while also not rejecting them. So, it's very tricky stuff. Now, here's where a lot of people lose Freud too, is the notion of castration anxiety. Again, we're really not talking about the penis here. We're talking about the phallus. We're talking about the symbolism of the penis, what it means. In Freudian terms, what it means is power, the power of the father. And so the child has castration anxiety. The child sees the father, sees his power over his mother and over the child, and recognizes that in phallic terms. And thus fears that he, the male child, will lose that power because his father is powerful. And he, as a male, he knows he has that power potential, and that the father can take that away. Little girls, Freud said, have penis envy. They have a lack. They have nothing. I'm quoting. They have nothing between their legs, and they envy their brothers, fathers, other men or boys because they have something. And so there's penis envy. Now, I must not stop there, and I should let you know that feminist psychologists have developed a counter to this that is pretty interesting and compelling. And they, Freud and theorists like him actually have womb envy because they cannot reproduce life. We've actually talked about that a lot here. I don't know if you're watching The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah. You're what? Living it? Fair enough. The novel's brilliant, and there's a scene in the novel where Offred she's forbidden to write, but she finds a way. Well, I don't want to spoil anything for her. She's forbidden to write, but she does receive some writing, and it's from one of her predecessors. And of course, the novel itself is her telling of the story after. I don't want to get into it too much, but there's a line that she says, where she says, she's just kind of free associating, if I may. And she says, penis envy, and then she rewrites it as pen is envy, to be able to write. And we've talked about this a lot. The writing culture is a masculine patriarchal culture. The pen is the power of the patriarchy. We can save that for the discussion after, but I just want to put that out there. This is probably the most critiqued notion of Freud, and I think for good reason. All right, so this is what I find really interesting, is the structure of the psyche. So the id, ego, and the superego. This rings true to me. I mean, we don't have to call it that, we don't have to become a Freudian, but there's a monster in me. A thing, an aspect of my psyche that is pure pleasure. It concerns itself only with the releasing of tension, which can be in the form of gaining pleasure or reducing or eliminating pain. That's the monster, the id. In fact, there's a great sci-fi film called Monsters of the Id. The id operates according to the pleasure principle. Period. I want pleasure. And if that means eliminating pain, then I will cry, I will scream out in my bed until someone comes and stops this, whatever this is. Right? This is the infinite. I want to feel pleasure. I'm hungry. That's a tension. I want that tension released. I will cry until I get a nipple or a bottle, and this tension is released. This is where the drives live, the libido, eros and thanatos. They live in the id. And this is where the unconscious is. And I keep saying the word monster because we did a course here called Gods and Monsters. And one of the talks was how to make a monster. And you've already got a monster in you. It's your id. And if you think about monsters as they're represented in cinema or literature, this is what they are. They just drive according to pleasure. They certainly don't succumb to society's mores, ethics, or customs. They don't even succumb to reality. They'll do things that are stupid, that make no sense, right? Just because they're driven by their pleasure principle, right? And that's what's so terrifying about it, right? They make no distinctions. They discriminate about nothing. They just want what they want. And that is a classic monster. Anton Chigurh. Or Samantha in Sex and the City. Or Quint in Jaws. The superego, let's go to the superego. The superego is the morality principle. That's not Freud's term, that's mine. Morality principle. The superego, you know, it is society internalized. It's those rules out there. This is not part of you at all, initially. It's society's rules that are communicated through your family, typically. This is do this, don't do that. Oh no, not with him, not with her. Stop that, go eat this. That becomes internalized. Well, that's not part of your psyche originally. That comes from culture. But you internalize it. Oh boy, do you internalize it, right? It's that voice in your head, the superego, that says, yeah, you should really do that. It's that voice in your head that says, yeah, let that person in on the freeway. It's the right thing to do. Whereas the id would be like, no, this is my space. I want to go there, and you're in my way. When the superego and the id get together, it's bad news. Because there can be this vicious cycle where the superego says you're bad, and the id says, yes, I'm bad. And then it's time to see a psychoanalyst. The superego, of course, in Jaws is Hooper. It's like, hey, you shouldn't do it this way. You shouldn't be hunting those sharks. Look, we can do it this way. In Sex and the City, I don't know, is it Charlotte or maybe Cynthia Nixon, especially now that she's running for governor. Yeah. Certainly the superego. And then the sheriff in No Country for Old Men. We can do this all night. The ego is really interesting. The ego, actually, we have I think Freud probably relied upon Plato for this. actually had a tripartite nature of the soul too. The body and its appetites, the soul, the mind and its desire for the forms, and then you had the soul, which was kind of the two horses. He called them a white horse and a black horse. And the soul was the charioteer. It was like, oh, God, we want to go this way. Same thing with the ego in Freud's tripartite nature of psyche. The ego operates according to the reality principle. So the infant is hungry. It sees this and it says, that looks like a nipple. Cool. And it sucks on the nipple. And the ego comes in and says, that's really not what you want. You want a nipple. You want a real nipple. That just looks like a nipple. And that will get you the nourishment you're seeking. So the ego is the central control. It's the operating system where it should be if you're going to be healthy. I think this rings true for me. We can argue with it, but it's one way to imagine our inner lives. But I think it's pretty compelling. Now, what happens when things go wrong? What happens with neuroses? Well, these are defense mechanisms, right? So the eruption of the unconscious into the conscious must be defended against. We cannot let that happen. So Freud came up with these notions of defense mechanisms. You probably used that phrase again, indicating a continuing influence of Freud. Our favorite defense mechanism is repression. Something from the unconscious emerges and we push it down. No, I'm not going to think about that or deal with that. I'm attracted to this person at work, but no, I'm not going to do that. I really want to, to go on a trip, but I can't afford it. I'm going to push that down. That's a bad example. It's pleasure. It's the pleasure principle. It's the id coming up in the unconscious, and the ego saying, no, or super ego sometimes saying, no, you don't want to do that, so you push it down. Well, the energy of the unconscious, of the id, is like a beach ball in a pool. You can push it down, but it's coming back up somewhere, always. And so, defense mechanisms are not in themselves bad. If you get angry at someone on the freeway and you want to kill them, you need to operate a defense mechanism there, because you shouldn't do that. Where it gets bad is where there's no outlet for it. And so, for example, if you keep it under wraps, if you keep your anger under wraps, it's going to appear in unlikely places. So you're angry at this person on the freeway, and you don't deal with it, you don't recognize your anger, you don't bring it into consciousness and let the ego deal with it, and you go home and you scream at your girlfriend. That's a pretty compelling case for our behaviors, right? Because something over there upset us, but something over here is where we act it out in our behaviors. The ego seeks to avoid internal conflict and pain, and to reconcile reality with these demands emerging from the unconscious, and that's a very hard task. And so we do need to use some defense mechanisms, but we must not forget the part of Freud's famous phrase: "You will experience the return of the repressed." It's like the return of the Jedi. It's not insignificant. That's why for Freud, dreams are so important. They're safe messages from the unconscious, because you're just dreaming. You're not going to act out your dream, right? So you can process that in a safe way, not hurt anybody. Slips of the tongue, other things like that, are key parts of the treatment of psychoanalysis, which I'm going to talk about next. Sublimation. Freud was famous for saying that Leonardo da Vinci had the Oedipus complex for his mother, and so he produced these great paintings. Right? So he had this feeling coming from the unconscious, in fact, coming from the Oedipus complex, sublimated it. That's where you repress it, but you allow it a channel out that is creative and productive. And often, in fact, more often than not, sublimation occurs in the greater society as a whole, because then you get super ego validation, as Da Vinci did. Right? He's a great artist. Oh, he's a genius. Right? That's a way to deal with it. Is it authentic and whole? No, but nothing is for Freud. You're just trying to move these energies around and keep from hurting yourself or somebody else. So if you produce great art as a result of some defense mechanism, cool, that's fine. Fixation, where you can't let things go, I don't think I even need to explain that. Regression, where you go back to a previous stage of your development because you haven't resolved things, or you haven't resolved things in the previous stage. So what is psychoanalysis? Well, it goes back to that very first publication or study Freud did about the talking cure, how if hysterics came in and we just let them talk, they got better. Why? Well, because of where it was happening and how it was happening. Right? So it was not out in the street where women were screaming and recounting their feelings in this very volatile and emotionally charged way. It wasn't happening out in the street. It was happening in an analyst's office. And in fact, the analyst had you lie on the couch, right? So you could be relaxed. In fact, the analyst was always out of your line of sight, right? So that you're not transferring anything, first of all, or you have less chance of transferring things, so that your unconscious can emerge, these feelings, these issues, these energies of your unconscious can emerge in a safe, relatively safe space. Okay? And that's how psychoanalysis works, if it works. You subtract the superego, right? So there's no judgment, right? There can't be judgment. Or your ego and your superego are going to kick in and shut it down. There can't be judgment. It has to be a free space. You must freely give, but you must do so in a way that is controlled by the ego. And the analyst is there in mythological terms as your helper. Say, okay, now what about this? And did that make you feel this? And so you're not alone because you shouldn't be alone because you can't handle this. At the same time, the analyst must not intrude on your experience. It's a very delicate process, and in fact, if you've ever been to it, it's a very expensive process. And it's a very long process. I think Woody Allen's been in analysis all his life, and we see how well that's working. Sorry, that's cheap. Free association, where the analyst simply asks you to just say some things, however they come to mind, right? What's happening there? He's trying to get past the ego defenses to the unconscious, to the id. And then what you get from that talking cure, from that talking process, and from bringing that all out, or it's not all, but bringing some of these things out, these unresolved conflicts that you're unaware of, that you're carrying around but are unaware of, what you get is catharsis, release, tension, release. The critiques of Freud are based on the science of psychoanalysis. Remember, he always was talking, imagining being a scientist, a physicist even, a medical doctor. But the Oedipus complex is not a scientific theory. Far from it. It's a myth. It's a story. But Freud would never acknowledge that. And if you study the philosophy of science at all, you'll know a man named Karl Popper who said, well, okay, but you can call something science, but if it's not falsifiable, then it's not scientific. There are plenty of other things that you can do. You can tell stories, you can create art, you can imagine things, but that's not science unless it's falsifiable. Please show me how the Oedipus complex is falsifiable. You cannot make it false. You cannot test it until it's proven false, and therefore it cannot be true as a scientific theory. The coherency psychoanalysis. What's attractive about the theory, I think even today, is that it seems to offer us really solution, a panacea to our problems. It's not an easy one, but at least we can explain, or at least there's a possibility of somebody finding out why we do the things we do. There's a rationality. I don't even want to say rationality. There's a causality to it. Oh, in this stage, you didn't resolve this oral conflict. It's almost too easy. In fact, it probably is too easy. Again, if you're going to make this a scientific theory, then that's not going to work. If you're going to make it a story, then that's a different matter. The essential nature of psychoanalysis. I did not know this till I did this research. Let me just read you this from one of my sources. At a less theoretical but no less critical level, it's been alleged that Freud did make a genuine discovery which he was initially prepared to reveal to the world. However, the response he encountered was so ferociously hostile that he masked his findings and offered his theory of the unconscious in its place. This is from a writer named James Song, The Assault on Truth. What he discovered, it has been suggested, was the extreme prevalence of child sexual abuse, particularly of young girls, especially in the 19th century in Vienna. He did, in fact, offer an early seduction theory of the neuroses, which met with fierce animosity, and which he quickly withdrew and replaced with his theory of the unconscious. So, how interesting and troubling is that? That what he had stumbled upon was simply an epidemic of child sexual abuse. And instead of saying, there's an epidemic of child sexual abuse among us, he masked it in the theory of the unconscious. Well, the other thing is the efficacy of psychoanalysis. If you've been through psychoanalysis, as I said, it's long, it's expensive, and the results are debatable at best. On the other hand, if you've been to therapy or counseling, as I have, as I'm sure many of you have, I think the value of the talking cure is still there. Now, it's not automatic, it's not formulaic, but to be able to tell your story and to have someone tell it back to you, quite simply, is very powerful. That's when therapy has worked for me. There are theoretical reasons for this that I could get into with Mikhail Bakhtin and others, but I think it's basically that simple, is that there are things in us that we can't see. Freud was right about that. Forces at work that we can't get a hold of, but if we tell it to someone else, we get it out, and they tell it back, and then we see it. We can talk about Freud and religion if you want. Freud and culture. Not a fan of religion. Not a fan of culture, by the way. Both are basically missing father figures.
Could you talk about the oceanic feeling really quickly?
Sure. It's that notion of that we probably have in childhood and infancy even, that is really the best description of it is from the Genesis myth. It's being in the garden. This sense of being so integrated into the world that even though you know you're an individual, you are so connected to the world, you're like the ocean, you're a drop in the ocean. And that feeling is, I would say that's a religious experience. Freud doesn't want to say that, but we see that throughout the world. This experience of the other and this connection back to who we are within the other, so that the distinctions collapse.
Doesn't he equate it to the time of the womb?
He does, yes, but other times as well. And so he actually says that civilization cannot allow for that because it's uncontrollable. And civilization is our great replacement for the Father. And so civilization is about order. And that is by definition unordered. It's an oceanic field. You can't order the ocean. All right, I want to let you get in here. For me, the genius of Freud is that he was a scientist who was a storyteller, but he repressed, if I may, the fact he was a storyteller. He kept trying to be a scientist. That this story was a myth. It wasn't just a story. It was a story with power and meaning and therefore orientation in the world. And the story provides a sense of survival. You can test scientific theories. There's a clear method for doing that. But the way you test a myth is by living it. And they all work, but none of them work forever. And so we're constantly changing our myths. There's the great Howard Nemerov had this wonderful poem to Freud, and I thought it was really good. I wanted to close with. Each house had its ghost, graves opened to his voice. The dead lived in him by his gray consent. He was, by their constraint upon his choice, Orpheus of all the lonesome. Spent his evenings charting out a private hell, the spaceless realm that all the puzzled caught, the swamps that made their frightful towns unwell. He chained his life to theirs, was like them, lost. Perhaps unwillingly he did this, became laureate of those who were afraid. For himself, assumed them as a native guise, entered their warring lands as one of them, employed their rhetoric and black to raid the towers of their most strategic lies. Wow, that is excellent. Thank you for your attention.